Hi class. Today we are going to talk about the skeletal muscle anatomy and physiology. In lab, you will mainly focus on learning the names of the muscle or identifying the muscles and memorizing the origin, insertion and action. And I will make another short video talking about what you exactly need to know for lab and what you exactly need to know for lecture. So stay tuned for that. Okay, so this lecture will mainly focus on the anatomy of skeletal muscle, and it will also talk about how skeletal muscle functions. We will look into some pictures like, how do we get muscle fatigue and things like that, but that will be another installment that is not included in this lecture. All right, so we will start with some, hold on. Okay. We will start with some 4 basic characteristics of muscle tissue. The first one that I'll talk about is excitability. What is excitability? When a muscle cell is stimulated by the nervous system, by stretching or by other stimuli in the environment, it responds by initiating electrical changes that sweep across its entire plasma membrane and spark internal events leading to muscle contraction. So that's excitability. You can excite a muscle fiber or a muscle cell by electrical stimulus. The second one is contractility. Now, stimulation of muscle cells generate tension, right, within the cell, which may cause the cell to shorten. This shortening results in either a pull on bones of the skeletal system or the movement of specific body parts. Do you agree? So that's contractility. It generates tension that causes the skeleton to move. The third one is elasticity. A contracted muscle cell doesn't remain contracted forever, right? So if you contract a muscle cell, it recoils to its resting length when the applied tension is removed. Thus, elasticity is not a muscle's ability to stretch. Remember that. It's not the muscle's ability to stretch, but its ability to return to its original length when the tension is released. The fourth one is extensibility. A muscle cell must be capable of extending its length in response to the contraction of opposing muscle cells. For example, when you flex your elbow joint, you are contracting the biceps brachii on the anterior side of your arm, and you are extending the triceps brachii on the posterior elbow joint. During these movements, muscle cells undergo alternating cycles of contraction and extension. Hope that was clear. And from this slide, you just have to memorize the 4 basic properties and know what they are. Moving on to some basic functions of the skeletal muscle tissue. The skeletal muscles help us in many ways. The first one is body movement. Okay. Now, we know that the integrated functioning of the muscles, bones, and joints can produce both highly coordinated movements, such as running, and relatively simple, such as localized simple movements like reading a book, reading a book or doing minor things. Therefore, attachment of skeletal muscles to bones help us move the body. There are muscles in your body that helps you to maintain posture. Right now, or in a regular classroom, when I lecture and students are seated in their particular places, they have to maintain posture. Students maintain posture, and that is helped by postural muscles which are located along the back of your body. Those are called posture muscles. Then temperature regulation. Now, energy is required for muscle tissue contraction, and this energy is broken down and heat is a byproduct, right? Most of this heat actually maintains a normal body temperature. When you exercise, do you feel hot? Yes, you do. You feel warmer because the heat is produced by breaking down of energy, and that happens because the muscles are working out. So as we work out our muscles, energy is broken down to release heat, which keeps our normal body temperature. Likewise, you shiver when you are cold because your muscles are contracting and relaxing to produce heat. So that's why we shiver. Alright, storage and movement of materials. Now, there are circular muscle bands called sphincter muscles, which contract at the openings or orifices. Now, these sphincter muscles, they actually regulate movement of material throughout the GI tract, let's say for example. Now, there is a sphincter muscle called upper esophageal sphincter, which is located on the superior part of the esophagus, and that regulates our swallowing, right? We swallow food down the esophagus into the stomach, and this is regulated by the upper esophageal sphincter muscle. You can imagine sphincter muscle as a rubber band, which kind of opens and closes and regulates passage of materials through the tube. Then there is a lower esophageal sphincter muscle that regulates movement of food from the esophagus into the stomach. Now, the food has to remain in the stomach for some time, as we learned in digestive system, because the food is now getting mixed with different digestive juices, acid, hormones, all these things. Therefore, there is another sphincter muscle called pyloric sphincter that regulates movement of food from the stomach to the duodenum, which is the first part of the small intestine. Therefore, we see that these circular bands of muscles called sphincter muscles help in movement of materials throughout the GI tract. All right. Then support. Skeletal muscle is sometimes arranged in flat sheets or layers, such as along the walls of the abdominal cavity and the floor of the pelvic cavity. And these sheets of muscles protect organs and support their weight within the abdominal pelvic cavity. Right here, we do see a woman measuring the circumference of her abdominal cavity. And do you see the flat muscles? The flat muscles of the abdomen, they help to protect and keep the organs in place. All right. Now moving on to the anatomy of the skeletal muscle. I draw out this in my regular class. So I just tried drawing this on my surface. Hopefully it'll make sense to you. All right. Looking at the anatomy of skeletal muscle, we are on the very left hand side. You see bones, and you also see a muscle in red attached to the bone, right? Now let me change color. Now let's say we make a transverse section or a cross section through the muscle, and when you make a transverse section through the muscle and you look at it, you see multiple bundles. So right here, the red part is muscle. That's your entire muscle. And if you zoom in, you do see multiple green circular bundles, right? These green bundles are called fascicles. Sorry. These are called fascicle. Each is called a fascicle, right? So what do we see? We see a big muscle, and within the muscle we see numerous bundles called fascicles. If you pull out one fascicle and zoom in, you will see multiple rod-like structures, And these rod-like structures are called muscle fibers in purple. Okay, so we have muscle. Within the muscle we have fascicles. If you look into each fascicle, you see numerous muscle fibers. Now within the muscle fiber, do you see the blue rod-like proteins? Yes. So each muscle fiber has hundreds to thousands of these rod-like proteins, and these are called myofibrils. Okay. And if you zoom into each myofibril, which we will do in the next slide, remember myofibrils are actually made up of proteins called myofilaments. Again, we will look at it in the next slide. So myofibrils in turn are made up of myofilaments, and there are two types of myofilaments that we will talk about. We will talk about thick filaments made up of myosin protein, and we will talk about thin filaments made up of actin protein. Don't worry, we will look at all these. So to review, we do see a muscle, a red colored muscle here attached to bones. If we look at a cross section of the muscle, we see numerous bundles, and each of these bundles is called a fascicle. If you zoom into each fascicle, you see multiple rod-like structures, and each of these is called a muscle fiber. Remember, a fascicle can have many muscle fibers. If you look into a muscle fiber, a muscle fiber can contain hundreds to thousands of rod-like protein structures, and those are called myofibrils. Remember, a myofibril is made up of myofilaments, and there are two types of myofilaments we will look at. We will look at the thick filaments, which are made up of myosin proteins, and thin filaments, which are made up of actin proteins. All right. So right here we are looking at a myofibril. So this is a myofibril, a zoomed in version of myofibril. And within the myofibril, do you see the black and red proteins? Yes, those are the myofilaments. So the black and red proteins together, these are the myofilaments. As I mentioned, the myofilaments are made up of two types of proteins. The red ones are called thick filaments, and the black one, and remember, the thick filament is made up of myosin protein, and we will look how a myosin protein, we will look at the structure of myosin protein a little later in this lecture. And then we have the thin filaments. These are the thin filaments, and the thin filaments are mainly made up of actin proteins, but then when we look into the thin filaments, we will see other associated proteins. Okay, one thing I want you to see here, myofibrils are these long cylindrical or rod-like proteins, right? And remember, the myofibrils run the entire length of the muscle fiber. You can imagine this as a package of cigarette. So if you take a pack of cigarette, the pack of cigarette will be your muscle fiber, and within the cigarette pack, you will see individual cigarettes. And those individual rod-like cigarettes can be compared to myofibril. And within the cigarette, what do you have? You have the tobacco, right? So the myofilaments, the thick and the thin filaments, can be compared to the tobacco inside. I want you to notice that the myofilaments, or the thick and thin filaments, are organized in a particular pattern within the myofibril, right? And each, actually, I'll talk about this a little later.